My name never made the slides. Not once. For 8 long years, I built the core data pipeline that kept the lights on at Aegis Tech. Every quarterly presentation deck just listed the technology department, with no footnotes, no acknowledgments, and no reckoning of the endless nights I spent debugging the infrastructure. It was a ghost in my own creation. The moment Bradley Reynolds walked into the office wearing $1,200 designer loafers and talking about agile metrics, I knew my days of quiet productivity were numbered. He looked at me during our first meeting as if I were an expired coupon, someone who was still technically functional but too embarrassing to use in public. Bradley was the definition of a disruption executive. A man who had never written a single line of production code but possessed an unlimited supply of buzzwords and corporate arrogance. Within 3 weeks of his arrival, the writing was on the wall. I received a calendar invite for a meeting titled Talent Alignment Strategy, Phase 1. It was a thinly veiled corporate purge, a method to push out the experienced engineers who built the system so Bradley could replace them with his own team of loyal followers. I decided right then that I would not go quietly. I began keeping detailed records, but not the kind that human resources ever got to read. Aegis Tech had been a different place when I started. We were a lean, focused group of engineers trying to solve complex enterprise problems. Now, the office was dominated by synergy meetings and town halls where Bradley grinned like a television evangelist who had just discovered sticky notes. He spoke constantly about flattening the organizational structure and empowering teams, which in reality meant promoting his former college friend Jason Miller to be my co-lead in research and development. Jason was a man who once asked me in a public Slack channel if an API was a type of hardware. It was painful to watch. Bradley slapped Jason on the back during the announcement, claiming that Jason brought a fresh perspective to the core stack. That fresh perspective meant playing golf with Bradley on Thursdays and confusing basic software tools. Slowly, the walls began to close in on me. I was omitted from email threads with major clients. My recurring roadmap meetings were rescheduled without my knowledge, often shifted to times when I was already booked for system maintenance. And then I was marked as absent in the official meeting notes. It was the classic soft freeze technique, a strategy where a company does not fire you directly, but turns down the volume of your existence until you decide to leave on your own. But I did not panic. I spent my nights committing clean code, writing detailed system documentation, and updating patent applications. My name sat on every single line of code, every system design document, and every architecture layout. They assumed I was just grinding through the final stages of my career, trying to protect my retirement. In truth, I was documenting my legacy. I visited the legal department under the guise of updating my estate planning files. I brought coffee for the administrative assistants and smiled warmly. I met with Roger Higgins, our general counsel, who was a quiet man who had worked at the firm since the early days. I asked if I could retrieve my original employment contract from 2018. I told him I wanted to make sure my personal records were in order for my trust. Roger was happy to help, pulling up the file and sending it to my personal email address. I did not mention that I was looking for a very specific clause. Tucked into the index of the 2018 restructuring agreement, under a boring section labeled Intellectual Property Assignments, was Section 4B. It was a provision I had fought for during the acquisition transition, a time when the legal team was too overwhelmed with paperwork to argue about a minor clause in a senior engineer's contract. The clause stated that in the event of termination without cause, all intellectual property authored or materially contributed to by the employee would immediately revert to that employee. I had authored 95% of the platform. Bradley did not know any of this. He was too busy scheduling team-building exercises and giving interviews to industry blogs. He saw me as a relic of the old guard, a piece of overhead that could be trimmed to make the company's balance sheet look more attractive to venture capital firms. I watched him in the hallways laughing with his new hires, talking about how the company was moving past legacy codebases. The legacy codebase was the only reason the platform was able to process millions of transactions a day without crashing. I kept my head down, committed my code, and verified my permissions. I checked the logs daily, ensuring that every commit was signed with my digital certificate and verified by the automated build servers. I wanted to make sure there was no doubt about who built the foundation of Aegis Tech. When I sat at my desk looking at the complex web of services I had created over the last 8 years, I felt a strange sense of peace. I was not angry about the disrespect. In the corporate world, anger is a liability. The only thing that matters is leverage, and I was about to prove that my leverage was absolute. I wrote down the final details of my plan, stored them on an encrypted personal drive, and waited for Bradley to make his next move. The next step in my quiet isolation came on a rainy Thursday morning. Bradley called an all-hands meeting for the Research and Development Department. The office was quiet, save for the sound of rain drumming against the glass. He stood in front of the whiteboard, his sleeves rolled up to reveal an expensive fitness tracker, and announced that we were injecting new energy into our technical leadership. He talked about bridging the gap between historical architecture and future scaling before gesturing to Dylan Pierce. Dylan was 26 years old, and 4 years ago I had hired him as an intern. I spent months teaching him the difference between a database query and an API call, and now he stood there in a branded fleece vest, nodding along as Bradley named him the new Director of Systems Innovation. Bradley explained that Dylan would now oversee the integration of our core data pipeline, working alongside Jason Miller. The announcement was met with polite applause from the newer staff, while the senior SAR developers stared at their keyboards. Dylan looked at me with an awkward grin, thanking Bradley, and saying he could not wait to learn from my experience. I smiled, nodded my head, and congratulated him. I did not point out that Dylan was about to take charge of a system he did not understand, a platform that would fall apart without my constant intervention. Immediately after the meeting, my permissions began to disappear. I logged into my workstation, only to find a red access denied warning on the database administration panel. When I asked Jason about the change, he claimed that Bradley wanted to streamline administrative roles to minimize security risks. He assured me that I was still the technical anchor of the team, but he wanted Dylan to handle the day-to-day operations. My calendar was cleared of client feedback sessions and architecture reviews. I was left with nothing but minor bug fixes and routine maintenance tasks. It was a clear attempt to make me feel useless, to push me into resigning so they would not have to pay me severance. Instead of complaining to human resources, I walked back to the legal department. I brought Roger Higgins another cup of coffee and sat in his visitor chair, chatting about his recent vacation. Roger's office was filled with the smell of old paper and peppermint tea. He was a man who preferred physical folders to digital files, which was exactly why I liked him. I casually asked him if the terms of the 2018 agreement were still active. I mentioned that I was finalizing my estate documents with my attorney and wanted to ensure there were no conflicts. Roger pulled up the system directory, verified the document signatures, and confirmed that the contract remained in full effect. He even noted that the company had never issued any amendments to Section 4B, as the executive team was always too focused on short-term quarterly metrics to worry about legacy employment agreements. With the legal validity of the clause confirmed, I spent my evenings gathering evidence. I compiled a complete history of the repository logs, archiving every single commit I had made over the past 8 years. I exported the revision histories from our documentation platform, highlighting the architecture designs and technical schematics that bore my name. I was careful to perform all of this work on my personal laptop, using my own local backups to avoid raising any internal alarms on our network security systems. I found the original design diagrams for our core load balancer, a module that handled over 90% of our traffic, and noted that my digital signature was embedded in the metadata of every single technical asset. I also reviewed the patent applications that the company had filed over the years. Matthew Vance was listed as the primary inventor on 5 separate filings, all of which described the very algorithms that ran our real-time processing engine. They had built their entire market valuation on my intellectual property, yet they were preparing to toss me aside as if I were disposable. I kept compiling my records, building a bulletproof folder of evidence that proved my authorship of the technology stack. I organized the files into subfolders, categorized by date and commit hashes, ensuring that even a non-technical judge could easily track the timeline of my contributions. Meanwhile, Bradley was accelerating his campaign. He invited local tech reporters to tour the office, showing off the dashboards I had designed while explaining how his new leadership team was transforming the business. I watched from my desk as Dylan struggled to explain the data pipeline to a visiting journalist, referring to our machine learning models as automated database filters. Bradley just smiled, nodding his head like a proud father at a school event. I did not correct them. I simply returned to my workstation, continued my document audit, and waited. I knew that the system was built on a complex web of custom scripts and configurations that only I understood. If they wanted to pretend that my work belonged to a committee, they were welcome to try. I was making sure that when the time came, the documentation would speak for itself. I was 48 years old, with over 20 years of experience in the software industry, and I had seen many executives try to claim credit for their engineers' work. Bradley was not the first, but he was going to be the last one who ever tried to steal mine. I packed my leather briefcase at the end of the day, feeling a profound sense of clarity. The corporate game had rules, and I was simply playing by the ones they had signed. By the second month of the reorg, the situation grew even more absurd. During our bi-weekly product sync, Dylan Pierce presented our new anomaly detection module to the board of directors. The slides he used were identical to the ones I had written a year prior, down to the exact block diagrams and flowcharts. The only difference was that Dylan had placed his own name at the bottom of the title slide, branding the entire subsystem as Dylan AI. He stood in front of the board, talking about how his team had developed the technology over the last few months, using agile development methodologies. He attempted to explain how the platform routed incoming traffic through database tables, but he incorrectly referred to the primary partition keys as folder labels. I watched from the back of the room as one of our board members, Catherine Foster, asked a detailed question about the scaling latency of the system under heavy loads. Dylan froze, looking like a deer caught in headlights, before Jason Miller quickly stepped in to redirect the conversation with a collection of meaningless buzzwords about artificial intelligence synergy and cloud transformation. In reality, that subsystem had taken me 9 months of continuous research to build and another 4 years to defend from senior managers who wanted to simplify the core logic for short-term cost savings. Bradley sat in the front row, nodding with enthusiasm and praising Dylan for his forward-thinking leadership. When the meeting ended, Dylan sent a message to the R&D Slack channel, posting a rocket emoji and celebrating the team's success. I captured a screenshot of the message and added it to my personal drive under a folder named Documentation Theft. A few days later, I received an unexpected message from Brian Croft, an external contractor who had helped us with network security configurations since 2020. Brian was a quiet, highly competent systems engineer who rarely interacted with the management team, but he was exceptionally observant. He asked if I could hop on a private voice call outside of the company network that evening. When I answered the call, Brian told me that he had overheard Bradley talking to our chief financial officer after a board meeting. Bradley had explicitly mentioned that they were planning to announce a major organizational restructure at the upcoming shareholder summit of 2026. He had stated that they would announce my retirement at the event, framing it as a strategic passing of the torch to a younger, more energetic leadership team that was fully aligned with the company's new digital vision. Brian wanted to warn me, knowing how much of the platform I had built from scratch and feeling that the management's actions were deeply unethical. I thanked him for his honesty and support, telling him that I appreciated his loyalty, and hung up the phone. The news did not surprise me. In fact, it was exactly what I had been anticipating. The shareholder summit was the ultimate stage, and Bradley was setting it up for his own glorification. I immediately went to work preparing my final legal response from my home office. I sat at my desk with a cup of black coffee, drafting a detailed email to myself using my personal account. I added Roger Higgins and the legal department as carbon copy recipients, and blind carbon copied Marco Delaney, our oldest investor who had always respected my contributions. In the body of the email, I cited Title 17, United States Code, Section 106, which protects the exclusive rights of copyright owners, and Title 35, Section 271, governing patent infringement. I attached the complete archive of my Git logs, the patent filings listing me as the primary inventor, and a PDF copy of my 2018 employment contract with Section 4B highlighted in yellow. The clause was clear: if I was terminated without cause, all intellectual property I had authored would immediately revert to me. I saved the email as a draft, ready to send the moment Bradley made his public announcement. I also prepared an encrypted drive containing a copy of the core codebase, ensuring that I had a secure record of the platform as it existed before Summit. The atmosphere in the office became increasingly tense as the summit approached. Bradley was busy rehearsing his presentation, while Dylan and Jason struggled to manage the day-to-day operations of the platform. They had already caused 2 minor outages by misconfiguring the routing tables, and both times they had secretly messaged me to help them resolve the issue. I had fixed the problems quietly, but I had also documented the interactions, showing that they were entirely dependent on my knowledge to keep the system running. I spent my last week at the office completing my documentation, ensuring that every file was updated and every signature was verified. I was calm, focused, and completely prepared. I knew that Bradley believed he was playing a high-stakes game of corporate chess, but he did not realize that I had already mapped out every move. I was ready to watch the dominoes fall, and I knew that when the dust cleared, the company's leadership would finally have to face the reality of what they had done. I sat at my kitchen table, reviewing the legal citations one last time, making sure that every date, time, and contract reference was perfectly aligned. The grand ballroom of the hotel was filled with the hum of conversation and the smell of expensive catering. Shareholder representatives, board members, and major investors sat at round tables, reviewing the annual reports and sipping morning coffee. The air was thick with expectation, and the soft lighting cast long shadows across the heavy carpets. On stage, a massive projection screen displayed the Aegis Tech logo alongside the phrase, "Building Tomorrow Together." Bradley Reynolds stood under the bright spotlights, wearing a tailored suit and his signature grin, looking like a man who was about to inherit a small country. Behind him, a high-definition video showcase cycled through the platform's core features, showing the data visualization tools and analytical dashboards that I had spent years designing. He showed charts illustrating our transaction throughput scaling from 3 million requests per day in 2019 to 25 million requests in 2025, claiming that this was the result of the new Agile leadership team. He presented detailed slides showing the architecture layout, explaining how their proprietary systems routed queries dynamically across cloud servers. My name was never mentioned on any slide, even though every diagram was a direct copy of my design schematics. Bradley stepped to the center of the stage, holding a wireless microphone. He began his speech with a slide deck filled with financial growth metrics and future projections, attributing our success to his team's focus on technological innovation. He spoke at length about the new R&D leadership, praising Dylan Pierce and Jason Miller for their work on the proprietary data architecture. After 10 minutes of corporate buzzwords, Bradley paused, adjusting his expression to one of solemn respect. He looked out into the audience and announced that as the company entered this new era of innovation, they were also celebrating the retirement of Matthew Vance, one of their longest-serving technical contributors. He described me as a foundational piece of their history and asked the audience to join him in applauding my years of service. A smattering of polite applause rippled through the room, accompanied by a few camera flashes. Bradley gestured toward me, smiling warmly, and asked if I would like to step up to the stage and say a few words. I stood up slowly from table 6, adjusting my jacket, and walked toward the stage. The walk felt long, the sound of my shoes on the carpet, the only thing I could hear over the murmurs of the crowd. I could see the satisfaction on Bradley's face. He believed he had successfully pushed me out of the company without any resistance. I took the microphone from his hand, feeling the weight of the moment, and looked out at the rows of investors and board members. I did not start with a thank you speech. Instead, I looked directly at Roger Higgins, who was sitting at the front table with the rest of the executive team. My voice was calm and steady as I spoke into the microphone, asking the general counsel if he would be so kind as to read Section 4B of my 2018 employment agreement into the official record. The silence that fell over the room was immediate. Bradley's smile froze, and he stepped closer to me, whispering that this was not the time or place for contract discussions. I ignored him, keeping my eyes on Roger. The general counsel looked confused, but he opened his laptop and began searching through his secure files, entering his administrator credentials. Within a few seconds, I saw the color drain from his face as he found the document and realized what I was asking. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with sudden realization, then looked at Bradley. Roger Higgins slowly stood up, holding his laptop, his voice cracking slightly as he read the highlighted text into the room. He explained that according to the 2018 contract, in the event of an involuntary termination without cause, all intellectual property authored or materially contributed to by Matthew Vance would immediately revert to him, including all source code, system documentation, and related patents. The general counsel adjusted his glasses, reading the precise legal definitions of reversion and authorship that I had negotiated during the acquisition transition. He explained that under the terms of the agreement, the company's license to utilize, modify, or distribute the codebase would terminate immediately upon my discharge. Bradley tried to take the microphone back, laughing nervously and telling the audience that we had a small administrative matter to resolve. I stepped back, keeping the microphone out of his reach, and spoke my second line, stating clearly that the clause was absolute. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the room as the investors began to realize the implications of what they were hearing. I placed the microphone on the podium, turned away from the stage, and walked back to my seat at table 6, leaving Bradley standing under the bright spotlights in complete silence. I watched as the board members turned to each other, their faces filled with shock as the reality of the legal reversion began to set in. The investor representatives were already on their phones, frantically calling their legal teams. They were whispering about material assets, risk exposure, and the immediate impact on the company's market valuation. One of our lead developers, sitting near the stage, looked at me with his mouth open, shaking his head in disbelief, while Dylan Pierce stood frozen behind the presenter's laptop, completely unsure of what command line queries to run to verify the claim. The grand ballroom, which had been a stage of triumph for Bradley, had transformed into a courtroom of consequences. The reaction in the ballroom was immediate and chaotic. Investors began whispering to their colleagues, while several board members stood up to demand a closed session. Bradley Reynolds was red-faced, gesturing frantically to the AV team to turn off the projection screens, but the slides showing my diagrams remained frozen behind him. Marco Delaney, our oldest investor, stood up from his table and asked Roger Higgins if the contract clause was indeed legally binding under state law. Roger, still staring at his laptop screen, nodded slowly and confirmed that the agreement was signed and fully enforceable. He explained that since Matthew Vance was the sole author and inventor on all core processing modules, database configurations, and 5 active patents, the company had just forfeited the rights to the entire technical infrastructure that supported their business. By firing me publicly without cause, the company no longer held any legal license to operate the platform or monetize the patents. We would be in direct violation of federal copyright and patent laws if we continued to run the software. Bradley tried to argue, claiming that the platform was a team effort and that the company owned the code, but Roger simply shook his head, stating that the contract was clear and did not contain any joint ownership provisions. Catherine Foster began raising her voice, asking Bradley how such a massive oversight had been allowed to happen. As the argument continued on stage, the projection screens behind Bradley began to flicker. The real-time data feeds that displayed our platform's metrics suddenly went blank, replaced by a series of system connection errors. From the back of the room, one of our lead junior developers called out that they had lost backend access to the servers. He explained that all platform tokens had been revoked and that the source repository had been pulled from the network. I had not hacked the system or destroyed any data. I had simply revoked the authorization keys that bore my digital signature, reclaiming the intellectual property that now legally belonged to me. The entire technical platform was now air-gapped and inaccessible to the company. Without my credentials, the system could not compile or run, rendering their product useless. The automatic backup routines tried to initiate, but they failed immediately because they required the same cryptographically signed authorization keys that I had disabled. Dylan Pierce was typing furiously on his laptop, sweat dripping from his forehead, but he could do nothing to bypass the security configuration. The system was locked down, and the console screen displayed nothing but access denied errors, indicating that the administrator override functions had been completely disabled. Jason Miller was leaning over Dylan's shoulder, shouting useless instructions about clearing the cache and rebooting the server nodes. But rebooting a system without valid author credentials was like trying to start a car without an engine. The security protocols I had built in 2018 were designed to protect the system from hostile takeovers, and they were performing exactly as intended. The core architecture was completely air-gapped, shut down and secure, awaiting the restoration of its rightful owner's credentials. Bradley rushed down from the stage, approaching my table with a look of desperation. He whispered that we could negotiate a new agreement, offering me a significant increase in equity, a seat on the technical advisory board, and a compensation package of $3 million. He pleaded with me to restore access to the servers, promising that we could resolve the misunderstanding in private. I looked at him, feeling no anger or satisfaction, only the quiet certainty of someone who had done their homework. I told him that the time for negotiation had passed and that the terms of the contract were already in motion. I gathered my personal belongings, stood up from the table, and walked toward the exit of the ballroom. No one tried to stop me. The security guards stood by the doors, looking confused, while the board members were already calling their legal representatives to discuss the financial fallout. The room behind me was a scene of rising panic, with executives arguing and phones ringing continuously as the news of the technical collapse began to spread. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of the hotel and stepped out into the cool morning air. The city was busy, with traffic moving along the streets and pedestrians walking past the building, completely unaware that a major technology firm had just lost its entire valuation in a matter of minutes. I walked across the plaza to a waiting car that I had booked earlier. As I rode across town, I looked out the window, feeling a sense of relief. For 8 years I had been a ghost in the machine, building a platform that made other men wealthy while my own contributions were erased. Today, the record had been corrected. When the car arrived at my destination, I walked into the lobby of a modern office building. I was met by Julian Mercer, the vice president of product for a major competitor, a man who had known me for years and understood the value of my work. He welcomed me with a warm smile, open doors, and a contract that recognized my true worth. I stepped into the boardroom, ready to build something new, knowing that this time, my name would be on the slides and my work would remain mine.